Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me here. I am a community-based orientation and mobility instructor from the Carroll Center for the Blind. So, many of you may be familiar with the Carroll Center and perhaps came to one of the programs here. I don't actually teach here on campus, although I have in the past. I exclusively work out in the community and I provide instruction to people wherever they may need it. So whether that is in their home, their apartment building, their school, their place of work, their medical facility, their neighborhood, the train station. I go anywhere. The world is my classroom. Um, if there's anybody here that is not sure what orientation and mobility is, I'm just going to briefly describe it. Um, so it teaches the skills and techniques that a person with vision loss needs to be able to navigate their surroundings safely, independently, and confidently. Um, and I should probably qualify that the independent part can be, to the best of the person's ability, considering what the surroundings are. Sometimes people need to recognize what their limitations are or what the hazards are in the environment in which they find themselves and be able to solicit assistance as needed. So, this can involve teaching you how to walk with a sighted guide in the most appropriate and efficient way. It often involves the use of a long white cane, of training your other senses to be aware of information and clues that can help keep you oriented in the area where you find yourself, and also, you know, planning routes, discovering what is the best route to get to someplace that you want to go. So that's kind of an overview of what it is. I not only provide instruction to people with long white canes, but also to people who use guide dogs. I do not train the guide dog, but once a person has a guide dog, I work with the team so that they're able to get wherever it is they want to go. So, in recent years, as you are all aware, the phone has become increasingly more powerful, and it seems like every few months there is a new app. And there have been developed in recent years a variety of apps to help people with vision impairments. And these apps can be useful to help with orientation and mobility goals. Um, I'm going to describe the apps briefly that we mobility instructors have found to be the most useful. Um, I'm not going to go into great detail about the apps and all the things they can do because you can find that information on YouTube, or you may have learned about that from a friend. Very often, what people want to know is this app worth it for me? And the answer to that is really going to depend on the individual. Some people really benefit from these apps in certain situations and in other situations not. Or one person can really benefit from it and another person cannot. So they're very powerful tools, but they sometimes are not as um, they're not as useful as sometimes we hope they are going to be. So I wanted to talk about that, from the point of an orientation and mobility instructor, what my experience has been and what other instructors that I meet with have also experienced. Um, the first app I want to talk about, it's called OKO, and that is spelled OKO. It is a pretty simple app to use. It is free to download, although currently it is only available on iOS. not on Android. Um, Recently, like in the past couple of months, I've had quite a few occasions to use this app. What it does is it helps the user identify when a traditional silent walk light is on. Now, Massachusetts has done a good job in replacing traffic lights with accessible pedestrian indicators. And I would say, I don't know, maybe 90% of the traffic lights now have the accessible pedestrian indicator that vibrates and makes a noise and lets you know that the walk light is on. But I still come across stoplights even in the city of Boston, like particularly the neighborhoods, and certainly in the outlying communities, like the suburbs, where the stoplights have not been modernized. And so this app is terrific because, you can, you really, once you download it, all you have to do is be able to open the app, and then it uses the camera feature on your phone um, to locate the walk signal. You kind of just lay it against your chest, you pan it around, and it will, once the camera is locked on the walk light, you will get a continuous message. Don't walk light, don't walk light, don't walk light. And then when the walk light turns on, it will make a noise to indicate it's on. And it will make a different noise when the countdown starts, if there is one. So I have found that this app is useful for, certain clients of mine who would not be able to access that bus stop or cross that particular street if it weren't for that app. Um, there is one particular lady who she has a pretty profound hearing impairment. She uses cochlear implants, and so she has a diminished ability to understand where traffic is in relation to her facing direction. Like it is more difficult for her to localize to sound. And because of this weakness, some people may be able to understand the traffic pattern well enough to understand, okay, the walk light is on, but not everyone can. So it's useful in that situation. It's also useful if it's a street that's not an intersection, it's just a walk light, and you have to cross one broad avenue and traffic may be intermittent. So, it's impossible to really accurately judge if the walk light is on or not. So, very useful app in those situations. Um,
Jill, if I can add something on that on Oko, I met with the developers of that at the ACB conference in Dallas last year, and their next thing that they're doing is, I guess, in modern uh, crosswalk light boxes or whatever, it actually has a Bluetooth signal capability, and what they're looking to do is have the app just as you get close enough to the crosswalk box that it would go right to your phone, so you wouldn't even need the camera anymore. The Bluetooth signal would tell, oh, now it's walk, now it's counting down from 10, 9, 8, and it'll all do it just by you approaching the intersection, and you won't actually need to do the camera. So that's what they're moving towards. But obviously that works as they modernize crosswalks with the new signal boxes.
oh, that's terrific. I did not know that. That will probably address some of the weaknesses of the Oko app because one of them is that um, you cannot use it safely at night because the camera is going to get confused by all the other lights in the background. So the accuracy is it's less reliable at night. It's also less reliable if it is precipitating. If it's a light drizzle, it still works pretty well, or if your camera is shielded by a umbrella. But most of the people I work with are adverse to using umbrellas. So, if your camera gets wet or, there's a lot of reflection bouncing off of the walk light because of the rain, the accuracy is less. Also, I have sometimes I'm in communities like Brockton or Framingham where a traditional walk light, not only has it not been updated, but it is so old that the app can't read it. So occasionally I come across walk signals where instead of the white man illuminated, it's actually the words the walk, WALK. App does not know what to do with that. Or sometimes the lights itself are so dim that it can't read, the signal. And you simply just you don't get a reading. You don't get that steady, don't walk light, don't walk light. So it doesn't work in every situation, but I have found it to be useful in most of the situations where we have tried to apply this app. You do need to be aligned properly at the crosswalk. So um, if you get to the stoplight, press the button hastily and whip out the app, and you are not properly aligned first, then you could make a mistake, right? You could be aimed at the wrong street. Or in the case of somebody with a hearing impairment whose cochlear implants or their hearing aids are synced in with their phone, you want to focus on aligning yourself first before you turn on the app, because once you do, you're going to be hearing the app in your hearing aids, and it's going to make it harder for you to align yourself. I'm going to move on and talk about GPS apps, um, because I find it's something that I have to talk about with my clients a lot. Um, GPS apps are now very well distributed. The general population uses them all the time for driving. A lot of people use them before they lost their vision, and they just continue to use them or rely on them after they've lost their vision. And I mean, they're wonderful. I use them a lot. I encourage people to use them, but I frequently work with people who are just learning mobility skills or thinking that maybe they need to be learning orientation and mobility skills. And I would say that if that is you, I would not encourage a person to rely too heavily on these apps. Um, as I'm sure many of you know, they will give you turn-by-turn directions. They're very useful for planning routes on public transportation, and they give you very accurate real-time information about the arrival of your bus and train. If you're on a bus or train and the stop announcements are not working, they're great because you can track your progress along the route and worry less about missing your stop. These apps, such like the Google Maps and the Apple Maps, they now have this new AI feature where you can pose questions such as, I don't know, where is the nearest bank or the nearest coffee shop? And, it will spit out the answer to you, in like a narrative statement where, it will tell you the name of it. It will give you a description of the establishment. It will tell you the location, about how far away it is, and then give you the option of either exploring the website further or giving you the route directions. So it's great. And whether it's Google Maps or Apple Maps, they both work equally well. Some people prefer Apple Maps because if you are using it to plan a route, it will just start the route immediately. You don't have to actually press stop. Whereas with Google Maps, you do, and sometimes people get frustrated because they just forget to hit start. Um, so, the advantage is, it can support wayfinding and it can support your awareness of your surroundings. Um, some people who have good orientation and mobility skills and good technology skills, and they use these apps may find that they don't need as many orientation and mobility lessons. They just may need the lessons to address trouble spots that they find or for more complex needs. Um, the caveat. um, I've worked with a lot of people who get into trouble using these apps, so I just wanted to talk about some of the limitations. Um, these apps will give you the most efficient walking route or bus route to your destination with a high degree of accuracy. However, it doesn't mean that it is a safe route or an accessible route for you. It might be okay for someone who's fully sighted, or it might be okay for one of your peers who may have, a different level of vision, who may have a different skill set, but it's not necessarily okay for each individual user. Um, there could be things like missing sidewalks or a parking lot or a street that is hazardous for you to cross, a crosswalk that skews at a weird angle and makes crossing that street particularly difficult, a bike lane, construction blocking your way. The app may indicate that you need to cross a street at an unsafe location. The app may direct you to cross a huge parking lot or direct you to cut through a park or a campus with myriad pathways that you could inadvertently get lost on. The app may not be accurate in identifying when you have reached your destination. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to use this in the context of a lesson where sometimes it's really dead accurate. I mean, it tells you you're at the destination when you're right at the door. And then other times it tells you that your destination is 75 feet in front of you and on the opposite side of the street when it's actually you're already there. So it's definitely, you have to be careful that you don't depend on the app too much. Um, you need to really have good technology skills to be able to use the app. If you're new to vision loss and you're not proficient at using voiceover and you struggle to see your phone outside, this may just be an added burden to you. Or, if you're not proficient at analyzing intersections and understanding traffic patterns and recognizing whether a particular street is safe to cross or not, then you know, it might not be appropriate for you to use that app in that situation. We live in New England, and unfortunately, our streets are not laid out on well-planned grids the way streets are organized in other cities. And, often there's a lot of irregularities and unusual things happening at our intersections. And sometimes, even though the app might be giving you accurate directions, like negotiating those intersections can just be very difficult if you don't have any prior understanding of what you are confronted with. So, an O&M instructor's job is to assess the safety and accessibility of a route for the individual student and suggest modifications or alternatives as needed. And I very often have to do this for routes that were planned using GPS technology. So I'm not saying don't use it because, like I said, they can be very helpful. But I do just want to make sure that everyone understands what the downfalls are. Um,
Jill, if I can jump in for 1 second.
mhm,
So I'm a heavy GPS user, but to your point, I had extensive O&M training with a cane and then extensive O&M training with a guide dog to learn how to orient and move without any sort of GPS. And now that I do use a GPS, which I use it every day for various things, um, it is always the second thing. The primary thing is my own skills and orientation and mobility. That is what I am relying on first. And the GPS call out of streets and things like that is a secondary piece of information that I'm utilizing, but it is not the primary. So to your point, where people rely on it too much, you really should rely first on your orientation and mobility skills. And this is a second piece of information. Um, do you happen to use the app like Voice Vista, which is a
Yes, and I'm going to
orientation?
get into that in a
Okay.
minute,
Okay.
because those other GPS apps, specifically for the vision impaired, run on the Google Maps, Apple Maps. You got two apps running at the same time.
Right.
So,
And
um,
it allows you to kind of custom some of those routes to.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I just wanted to share with you, I guess, two stories. I mean, these are just kind of cautionary tales, and then I will also tell you some success stories. Um, all right, there's a young woman that I am working with who has been historically resistant to orientation and mobility training because she wants to be like everybody else, and it does not fully accept how impaired her vision is. And she uses GPS apps to go a whole number of places, and her only reason for entertaining my services is because she wants a guide dog. Um, And, maybe about a month ago, she showed me the route that she was taking to a bus stop in Dorchester. And, this woman has no vision in her left eye and pretty limited vision in her right. And she was going to the top of her street and crossing, a fairly busy street. It definitely had the double yellow line and traffic chugs along at about 35 miles an hour. And she was crossing at an uncontrolled crosswalk by listening for gaps in traffic. And unbeknownst to her, immediately to the left of this crosswalk was a house where the owner or occupant of that house drove a bus and routinely parked the bus along the curb. So the bus completely blocked her from view of any oncoming driver from the left, and also interfered with her ability to hear traffic approaching from the left. So this was a really dangerous situation for her. And, I had to strongly suggest that she not cross there. And, what we ended up doing was taking a completely different route to a different bus stop, same bus line, but just a different stop. So, that's one situation. And yesterday I was working with a woman who um, she lives in East Boston, and she actually has been successfully using GPS technology to learn her neighborhood. And, she has, successfully taught herself routes to a variety of places. And she does have good orientation and mobility skills. She knows how to cross streets. So this app has worked well for her, and she's a fairly recent transplant to the area. She, moved from another part of the country. So I would say that this app has definitely reduced the amount of time I need to spend with her, acquainting her with her new surroundings. Now, she just got hired for a new job, and she interviewed online for this job, and she'd never been to the place. And, the route looked to be very difficult, I should say, or a little bit confusing when you looked at it on Google Maps. So, she asked if we could go there together. And, before I met with her, I actually, opened up the Google Maps and I checked out the route myself and found that it was 100% inaccessible for anybody wasn't safe for most pedestrians, but definitely not somebody with a vision impairment. Among other things, it required you to walk down an industrial road with no sidewalks and then cross an enormous parking lot where trucks pulled up to a loading dock. So we had to find an alternative that was absolutely not even an option using any of the maps, but we did find a solution. So, these are the sorts of things that you need to keep in mind whenever you are choosing to use the app. You also have to think about, well, I suppose before I bring up this last point, I'll talk about the apps that Aaron just referenced, Voice Vista and Blind Square. So these are GPS apps that just give you a little bit more additional information than your typical Google Maps or Apple Maps. They run on those apps in the background, but then they will give you information such as the name of the street you are approaching. So as you're going along, it will just read off every single street name. It will also mention things like the presence of bus stops, or it will tell you what businesses or points of interest that you are passing. And you have the ability to filter how much information you are receiving. So these apps can be very valuable tools for people who either want some reassurance about exactly what they are or just want more in-depth information about what is around them. And some people like them as like reassurance that, oh yes, I am where I think I am. Oh yes, I just passed that particular shop, that landmark. Yep, I know exactly where I am. Um, some people find the cognitive load of using these apps to be a little bit too much for them. So, you know, I I'm going to reference the the woman who really finds the OCO app to be extremely helpful to her, right? She is totally blind, hearing impaired guide dog traveler. She's got cochlear implants. And, this is somebody who travels extensively around Boston. She's got very good orientation and mobility skills, but because she uses cochlear implants and because she's totally blind, the cognitive load on her is pretty high whenever she is out and about traveling. She is thinking about what she's hearing, the changes under her feet, what her guide dog is doing. She's having to correct the guide dog. She's got to pull off the harness to let the dog do its business. There's an awful lot going on when she is out there traveling. And so for her, these apps, it's an added cognitive load, and for her, it's too much. Um, so this is why I say that for some users, like for example, Aaron, I know, um, he is somebody else who has no vision, who uses a guide dog. For him, the app is wonderful and very, very helpful. But for her, maybe because of the addition of the hearing impairment, it is too much. So it's kind of individual as far as whether you find it helpful or not. And if you're ever questioning it, it's very helpful to maybe do some practice runs with an orientation and mobility instructor to see how you manage it and how well you're able to troubleshoot when difficulties arise.
What is the app again?
The app there's Voice Vista and then there is Blind Square.
Thank you.
Blind Square is the one I am most familiar with. It does have a subscription cost. I think it's about $50. That's what it was the last time I checked. It's a one-time purchase price. You don't have to renew that every year. Um, but like I said, it does give you a lot of additional information about what is around you. It is not helpful for somebody who tends to get lost easily out there in the community. Um, A lot of people have asked me about that, and I've tried it. They're hoping that it's going to make them better travelers and that they won't get lost. In my experience, I think the cognitive load ends up being too much, and they're not able to problem solve when there is a glitch, like when the app is inaccurate or, there's something tricky about the environment, and it tends to make things worse rather than better. So, your orientation and mobility instructor probably knows you well and could advise you about whether it's something that would be useful to you or not.